everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started today. I'm Sheena Agarwal, the Chief Partnerships Officer with Myriad USA. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to our webinar on international giving. Our team is going to be sharing some insights from the region and looking into 2025 as we step into what's probably quite an uncertain year. Just a couple of housekeeping items. Participants are in listen-only mode, and that chat function is closed, but we do welcome and encourage you to share your questions through the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your screens, and we have allocated a bit of time towards the end of the webinar to answer many of them live. And behind the scenes, my colleagues are going to also be helping to address some of them over text. And if we're not able to get to your questions, we'll follow up directly with you if you provide your name with your question to make sure that we address everything that comes through. Translation is also available through the closed captioning button. So if you can go ahead and click the Show Captions button, if that's important, please do that on the Controls toolbar, and you can select your preferred language. And a reminder that the recording, it will be sent to everyone who registered. So if you need to pop off, we'll be sure to get that to you. So quickly, a word on Myriad USA. We are a public charity headquartered in New York, and we provide U.S. donors, whether individuals, families, corporations, foundations, and advisors, with a suite of services to support their international giving to anywhere in the world. And we also partner with foreign nonprofits and offer them solutions to receive tax-deductible gifts from donors in the U.S., and that's through our American Friends Fund service. And this past year in 2024, we facilitated around 169 million in grants across 90 countries. So we're really excited to continue to grow this reach in 2025. This webinar is the first in what we plan to roll out as a series throughout the year, where we're going to be showcasing expertise from our team, really in an effort to bring more donor education and thought leadership to the field. So we look forward to bringing you that content throughout the year, and we'll be sharing more about that as we move forward. But to jump in, I'm super excited to be able to introduce today's speakers, who are very easy to gush about because they're my fantastic colleagues. And they'll be bringing their regional expertise to the discussion today. We have Ellena Fotinatos, who's our Chief Operating Officer and Europe lead, Kady Sylla, who's our Director for Africa and the Middle East, and Carrillo Zegarra, who's our Director for Latin America and the Caribbean. And in the background, we also have a couple of folks. We've got our marketing manager, Marina Tachenko, and our director for family philanthropy, Rebecca Stibbe, who are also helping us with tech support and some Q&A roles. So you might see their names popping in. And we're going to be hearing from all of our leads shortly, but to start us off, I wanted to give a little bit of a broader overview on what we're seeing generally in the philanthropic sector as we step into this year. And I think it's important to recognize that we can't have a conversation about 2025 without first addressing the presidential executive orders that we've seen on international aid more recently, but also the broader agenda that's impacting investment across all development sectors, whether climate, health, humanitarian aid. There's certainly implications for that domestically, but in terms of the international space, we already know that this is causing massive disruption at the local level for international aid programs and organizations that are based overseas, either who had been receiving U.S. government funding or are connected to that ecosystem, and are now facing serious questions about their ability to continue to operate. Many we already know are starting to shut down or pivot programs. I think we're all sort of aware of this reality. So what does this mean for opportunities in philanthropy? Well, one is that we know generally that the role of proximate leaders in driving sustainable change in their community is super important, and that's now being disproportionately threatened with the funding freeze. And in terms of where Myriad USA sits in that space, we have a network of over 1,400 fiscally sponsored international nonprofits and hundreds of other grantees that are sort of broadly in that space. And we recently took a pulse survey to gauge generally the impact of this funding freeze to just get a sense of the impact to our network. And that survey's still open, but so far about 50% have indicated that they've either received a stop work order or are financially impacted in some way. So we do have a direct line to those hyper local organizations that do need funding, that are impacted. And so if there are any donors who are interested in having that conversation, we'd love to discuss it with you and see how we might help to close the gap. I think more broadly, philanthropy being the flexible and nimble vehicle that it's meant to be does need to step up. We can't fully replace the gap, but I think a lot of private foundations and donors are generally rethinking their grant-making strategies this year to kind of reflect this new reality. We're also curious to see how corporate social responsibility is going to shift. But I think generally, we are in a place as an intermediary to help facilitate that bridge between funders who are interested in how this is impacting local communities. So as you're starting to think about your giving, please do consider if we can be helpful. And kind of related to generally giving mechanisms that are developing in philanthropy, I think there's another trend emerging where we're definitely seeing a growing interest in new philanthropic vehicles like collaboratives, giving circles, multi-donor DAFs, mechanisms for individuals who want to pool funds, pool risk. And in the current climate, this definitely could be a great way to make impact and kind of join with other donors who want to talk about this space. We think generally there's a growing appetite for donor education and funders wanting to learn from others and seeing how to amplify impact so that you're not just working in a silo. And we've also seen interest from ultra high net worth individuals and new generation donors who are rethinking sort of the traditional model of setting up a foundation and starting to look at some of these fiscally sponsored funds, like I said, multi-donor DAFs, but really seeing how to innovate with the giving mechanism itself. And that's a shift that we've seen over the last couple of years, and we're excited to see how that might drive broader impact as we come into this year. But overall, lots of things are shifting in the sector. Geopolitically, our team at Myriad is tracking those really closely and looking at how to mobilize our networks as we move forward. But I'd love to hear after the webinar, if anybody has been thinking about that, please do reach out so we can have a conversation. And now I want to turn it over to our regional experts to do a little bit more of a deep dive into what they're seeing as insights and opportunities as we head into the year. So to start us off, Kady, who's our Africa and Middle East Director, coming into 2025, what do you really see as a pressing need in the Africa region that you think deserves attention from philanthropists?
Thank you, Sheena, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Great question, because I think it's important to underscore that even before all these executive orders, African-led nonprofits and social impact organizations have been disproportionately funded internationally. Bridgespan and the African Philanthropy Forum conducted a research 2 years ago, and I think DevEx also did. And they found that about less than 2% of international funding goes directly to African-led nonprofits. And the irony there is that while they're struggling to access resources and international funding, they continue to show consistently higher impact than their counterparts. And that's not surprising because many of them are embedded in the communities that they serve. They understand these communities and they certainly understand the needs that the communities are facing. And from an investor perspective, I would want to put my money there because they have their fingers on the pulse. And if I put in $1, I know that I can probably get $3 more or so. So hopefully that changes. There's definitely been an increasing visibility for African-led proximate leadership investment, localization. But with these executive orders coming in, it's just going to continue to undermine the impact that these communities have already contributed to on a string of investment. I'm glad that you mentioned the way that Myriad has created all these flexible solutions for donors to engage. I just want to underscore that from an African perspective, the organizations that we work with, they're going above and beyond with very limited resources to increase impact across the region, across their communities, and directly address needs. Two cases in point. We know that crises, I should say, in Sudan and the Congo have been going on for a very long time. They are receiving less visibility in international news. I mean, we hear some here and there, but not at the same level as other crises in the world. And yet we have a lot of local leaders that are directly providing humanitarian services, sometimes with no funding coming through, and are doing a lot more compared to international NGOs that are piloting in for a couple of months and then going out. So all of that to say that investing in proximate leadership, locally led organizations is cost effective. It's impactful because there are multiplier effects that play out beyond the funding that the donor gives. And if and when donors decide to step out, that impact continues. So I'll stop there and then see if there are any questions or anything I might be missing. Thank you.
No, that's really helpful. And I think also as a follow-up then, given that there's tremendous need and areas that deserve that attention beyond what you mentioned, really where should donors be investing right now? Are there any regions, are there any organizations that you think are worth mentioning?
Sure. So I had already mentioned that less than 2% of international funding goes to Africa in general. West Africa doesn't even get that level of visibility. No funding whatsoever. In Francophone Africa, even less so. And there are various reasons for that. Some are justified. One of the reasons, for instance, is a language barrier for many US donors that often don't understand French, and it's difficult to kind of communicate with partners on the ground for that matter, but it's no barrier that cannot be surmounted, right? Like Myriad USA, at least in the way that we leverage our regional expertise and capacity, is precisely language. Like if language is a barrier, we can help with that. I speak French. We have huge local networks that are embedded in systems there and also understand international philanthropy. So we rely on them to get the latest information from about opportunities and also challenges that a lot of these local organizations face. But West Africa has tremendous opportunity for investment that certainly should receive an equal amount of visibility as their counterparts, say, in East Africa and even maybe North Africa, for that matter. And some of the organizations that Myriad USA is already working with in West Africa is called Raw Material Company, which is based in Dakar. They are training the next generation of creative artists across Senegal and the West African region. These are directors, these are artists, curators, and you name it. And they're all young people. We also have Recyclers in Nigeria that is actually providing job opportunities for young people in Lagos through waste management. So they are not only addressing climate issues that many communities in Africa face, certainly in West Africa, they're also creating opportunities for young people typically living in the slums of Nigeria with no opportunities whatsoever to access the market and then contribute to their communities while earning an income. We have Baobab International, back to Senegal again, that is working with many universities in the US on exchange programs. They're building the next generation of cultural ambassadors. And this is very important, I should underscore, because of the unstable situation that, frankly, our global community is in. It's very important to understand people cross-culturally, regionally, and create mechanisms where we can identify our shared humanity for inclusive development. So Baobab International is doing great work in that capacity. We have FOOP fighting out of poverty in Sierra Leone. We have Yes Girls Leadership Foundation in Sierra Leone that is creating inclusive community development after in a country that has gone through a civil war and now is rebuilding itself. And these community-led efforts are absolutely necessary in order to, again, continue that impact long-term, but do it in a way that's cost-effective and sustainable. I mean, I can go on with the list. It's a very long list. We're just kind of pointing out that we have there are a lot of opportunities to engage in West Africa, and Myriad USA is certainly here to help donors, potential impact investors to engage.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for all of you listening, if there are certain areas that you're looking to get recommendations on or are interested in more detail from Kady, we can certainly follow up with her. and kind of wearing your second hat, which is overseeing the Middle East region. We know that that whole region is going through a very volatile time. There's a lot of fragile states and
Mhm.
conflicts. Generally, what are you seeing as opportunities for philanthropy for folks interested in that region?
Yeah, I think first, what's important to underscore is that indeed, while there is a lot of fragility around the Middle Eastern region, I think tied to that are also opportunities for innovation. There are many, these are countries that are still coming through the post-colonial process, just like in Africa. They're building, and the key to that building up is community-led efforts. Again, localization is absolutely key. In the case of the Middle East, Syria, which just went through a massive transition. In fact, as of today, the new leadership under the interim president al-Shara created a national dialogue in order to identify different stakeholders and mechanisms for inclusive development. So there's a lot of opportunities for donors to engage, especially because the restrictions that were on Syria have been removed, so people can engage through investment, both philanthropic and the market. And there is huge opportunity to help young people there engage with social impact through youth and women, especially women, in peace building process, community development. It's a country that's been devastated completely, and there is a huge opportunity to invest in communities that are rebuilding that process. So I wanted to just put a pin on that. And similarly with the Middle East, with the Palestinian peace building mechanism, it's still very fragile. I mean, there is a ceasefire, we all know, but a lot of things are hanging in the balance. For donors, there is a way to engage through humanitarian assistance, right? Communities need a lot of support, a lot of help, especially young people. Older people also, like vulnerable communities, I should say, vulnerable populations are in tremendous need of help through humanitarian assistance. We've got a lot of community-led organizations working not only in Palestine, in Gaza, but also in Egypt, which is next door. So if it's become challenging to access direct support in Palestine, Egypt is next door, and we've got many organizations based in Gaza, based in Cairo, that are helping provide humanitarian assistance. So there is tremendous opportunity for philanthropy to get engaged through social impact there.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Kady. And I know we could talk about this for an hour. So this is the brief overview of where we see opportunities for investment, but certainly if anybody has specific questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A and we can circle back with Kady. Moving to Europe, Ellena. We have kind of a different, I guess, landscape than what we just heard from Kady with the African Middle East kind of priorities. So, could you give a sense of how American giving towards European arts and culture has evolved in Europe, and what are some of the factors that are driving continued philanthropic support for that sector in particular?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Happy to talk about that for a few moments. There's clearly a long tradition of Americans looking to Europe for the culture, for cultural inspiration. So it's no surprise that the philanthropic dollars follow there. That's what we see at Myriad USA. We facilitated well over $100 million towards arts and culture initiatives in Europe, and there's no sign of that slowing down. Quite frankly, there's a lot of donors here in the US, mostly individual, but not only, that have these ties with these institutions abroad in Europe. And we see that continuing, and we see that there is a need from these institutions for this extra funding. That need is increasing. We see a lot of local governments and state governments cutting funding for these institutions. So there is an increased sophistication in their fundraising that maybe we didn't see 15 years ago, right? So we're seeing it mirror the institutions here more with full development departments and capital campaigns, and that's something that we will continue to see develop, and something that we help develop. In fact, And I think that it's a great partnership. Of course, a lot of the donors here in the US have ties back to Europe. Maybe they're part of the diaspora, maybe they're just art lovers, maybe they have a second home. Part of that, of course, is with the art market being what it is, we do have a lot of collectors that have beautiful pieces that they want to give to an institution abroad. And that's something that Myriad USA does all the time. And it's something that I think continues to bring interest when we talk about philanthropic giving to Europe. And of course, we have, in terms of countries, we have the usual suspects, right? So the Western European, but not only, we're seeing more and more into Eastern Europe, into Southern Europe, more interest there. So we're really making sure that the message gets out there and we diversify the kinds of cultural institutions that we're working with. And we've had great success with that.
Yeah, fantastic. And one of the things that we're trying to reflect on generally in this webinar is some of the geopolitical trends that are taking place globally. We know that in Europe in particular, there's been the rise of a far right movement. Is that affecting the nonprofit sector? What are you seeing? And are there any places where there might be opportunities for investment for philanthropists?
Yeah, sure. And we just had the German elections, and we see that the far right came in second there with the elections. And now in the EU, you have 7 member states with what are considered far right governments. Broadly speaking, these parties seek to narrow the role of civil society, right? It's reflecting in a lot of budget cuts. Of note in the Netherlands, it's worthwhile pausing on that for a second, because the Netherlands has been one of the biggest donors to nonprofits and civil societies across the world. And so that's been shrinking with broad implications there. We see that for sure as a trend, and the opportunity that it's opening up is really for individual donors to step in to fill those gaps. You have huge NGOs, like I said, a lot of them Dutch, but not only, that are working across the globe, that are based in Europe. So as that public funding dries up, what's the opportunity for individual donors to step in and to bridge that gap, to continue doing the great work that they're doing locally or abroad? And the need is there in Europe as well, obviously. The economic situation in Europe um, is not settled. We have a lot of communities hurting, conflicts obviously on the continent. So there is absolutely a role there for philanthropists to play.
Yeah, and maybe just to go deeper into that, more broadly outside of just the political trends, arts and culture, what are some of those other areas that you're seeing just becoming more prevalent in terms of social needs and that philanthropists should be looking at if they're starting to think about 2025?
Yeah, so let me start with kind of the needs that have been there for a while, which are the social needs, youth unemployment, social cohesion, migration, aging populations. These are needs that have been around for a long time, and they're all related to each other. In fact, these needs are definitely still there. We do struggle with unemployment in Europe in a way that we don't in the States, especially with the youth. You have far more rigid labor markets, and of course, part of that has to do with inclusion, social inclusion of folks that were born in that country, right? That's all they know, but are somehow still being excluded from accessing labor markets or accessing education. So that these are old issues, but very much still at the forefront. I think newer issues would be certainly, we talked about Ukraine. We're at, I think, the anniversary, I think, is this month, in fact. Continues to be a big attention point, continues to be a draw for philanthropic dollars, rightfully so. There's a large need there. We facilitated quite a bit of funds there, and we're happy to continue doing so. we're going to see that play out over a generation, right? So this is something that we don't see going away. Tied to the far right movement, we are seeing so many wonderful causes promoting the importance of free press. So that's a space that we've been in for a while. There's some wonderful causes, making sure that that propaganda is kept in line, if I can say it like that. So that these are worthy causes, and I'm sure that's going to come up more and more as we see how politics unfold in Europe. And then finally, I think I'd touch on climate and just the increased frequency of disasters that we're seeing in Europe, disasters that maybe we haven't seen before. You now have hurricanes in Europe, the flooding. I mean, really just the scale of these disasters is increasing. The extreme heat that we have summer after summer, the awful wildfires that really can drain resources in communities and governments. And, you know, the question there is, what is the role for philanthropy to fill? Because some of these might be immediate emergency needs, and others are really long-term needs as a community tries to rebuild.
Yeah, thank you. And I feel like, you know, we obviously spend a lot of time looking at the global south, but it's really important to remember that even Europe has a lot of ongoing and more recent areas for investment, and to not kind of keep that out of mind as we look into the year, because some of those are going to get exacerbated.
Certainly.
Thank you. We are going to shift now over to our lovely region in the South, Latin America and the Caribbean, where we have Monica with us to share a bit about trends that she's seeing. Generally, this is a region that we've been building and growing at Myriad USA with Monica's support. So I hope folks look to our organization if you have interest in just learning more about what we're seeing and some of the partnerships that we're developing. Monica, to start with, just looking again at the political trends globally and the way that the US government right now has been increasing deportations, and many of those impacting the region of Latin America in terms of where those populations are going right now. How is that impacting community development and social activities that partners on the ground and countries on the ground are being involved in?
Yeah, hello, happy to share, and thanks for joining this webinar. We expect that Latin America and the Caribbean will absorb a significant amount of migrants. So the new immigrants, or the people that they will come back home, they will require the reintegration into local communities. So this situation presents an opportunity to invest more in social services, because local communities and regional governments will be balancing investing resources on returned migrants versus attending other community needs. And that happened during the COVID time from a different perspective, when many people living in urban areas there came back home to the rural communities. And we saw a lot of conflicts and difficulties integrating these new people in the community. So we are expecting a lot of challenges, but a lot of opportunities as well. We anticipate the returns of the first generation of migrants, but we foresee, for that reason, the more opportunities to create more connection with the diaspora. Before this crisis, some embassies like Ecuador, they designed specific programs to connect people in Ecuador with the immigrants in the US. So there are already programs trying to connect the diaspora. So we are now expecting that this kind of program will grow. The different countries will take the leadership in the US, trying to support their communities from the US, sending maybe resources or trying to create business. That will maybe open the door for impact investment, and also for seed grants for social startups. No, it's also important to recognize that many of these deportations would affect specifically the first generations of of immigrants in the US. But the second generation, the young people that maybe they pay taxes here, they will have an opportunity to be more connected with their countries, no, because their parents and their relatives are back home, but also that will maybe open a door for giving circles, because we are already receiving some requests and exploration of young generations trying to see how they can contribute to their homes, no, because of this context.
Yeah. And I think, you know, what you're raising is that there's been more recent and forthcoming political trends that are going to be impacting the way that investment in community is going to happen. But there's also been some historic political trends, including things like the drug trade that's been a big part of what's created an economy in the region. Is that specifically with regards to security in the region, shifting opportunities for investment? What's the state of that now, and where are you seeing things moving based on kind of where the drug trade is?
Yeah, totally. USAID gave $2.4 billion to Latin America and the Caribbean, but Colombia was the most important grantee because of the political or geopolitical location. So Colombia and Peru, they have a very particular importance for the region, no, because Peru really has a lot of production of coca leaf, and Colombia is more connected to the traffic. Of course, this is not talking about stereotypes about country. Each country in Latin America, we have our own challenges, but the geopolitical context of Peru and Colombia has been historically a destiny of a lot of international funds. So something that we saw in the last years is that the increasement of agricultural initiatives to support the transition of farmers. So now we have a lot of projects promoting cacao, cafe, especially in areas where people usually they don't have cafe or coffee, no? So we are a little bit worried, of course, for this situation, because we also have the illegal mining crisis in Latin America. So one of the kind of challenges and opportunities is basically support farmers that they are already working on the transition, but also there is a lot of small startups that they have been very successful exporting these new crops, these new produce, no? And we are seeing a lot of opportunities there. And also this crisis gave many farmers a lot of chances to do transition from pesticides to agroecological techniques. So this is something that we are seeing as an opportunity as well. So just keep going with the money that can help farmers to reduce the use of pesticides, for example.
Yeah, thank you. And the other theme that sort of comes out when thinking about Latin America is certainly climate. We know that COP30 is going to be hosted in Brazil this year. Generally, it's a region with a lot of climate threats, but also a lot of momentum that's building with coalitions, with organizations who are focused on this. What trends are you seeing? And maybe any examples of, you know, when it specifically comes to productivity in the Caribbean, how is climate impacting investment opportunities for fishers and farmers?
Yeah, sure. It's important always to talk about the Amazon. No, the Amazon really comprises 9 countries in the region, and it's a region itself. No, we know that COP30 will be in Pará, but Pará is 3 times larger than California. So this is the dimension just of Pará. No, and this is what the COP will be in Pará, because it's very important to highlight the context of that region. So something that we see now is that need of working collaborative between countries. For example, we saw that the last year, Bolivia lost 10 million hectares of Amazon because of the fires. But one way that they really did very well is to work in collaboration with Brazil, no? Because Brazil also has the same challenges. So now we see more opportunities of this kind of projects, but also more attention to the impact on health of these fires. And also many people were displaced. So these kind of components about the impact on health and the displacement were not necessarily on the radar of donors many years ago. But we remember that in 2019, when we have the big fires in the Amazon, people really realized that it was not just Amazon, it's what happened with all the people living in that area. So we saw more interest, which is something very important. So a lot of interest on health programs, for example, in indigenous language that can really address this new context when you need to be displaced because of the fires. Another component that I think is important, many donors and communities are talking about other biomas, no? We have Cerrado, we have Chaco, and Chaco is the second largest forest after the Amazon, no, in South America. And Cerrado is one of the world's most biodiverse savannas, is the home of 5% of the planet's animals and plants. So now there is this need to understand Latin America and its complexity. No, in addition to the Amazon, we have different biomas, and we feel like there is more interest now. And we are, of course, here in Myriad very open to collaborate with any donors that have the interest. We are working with environmental funds in Latin America that they have the capacity to send money to very remote and small communities. No, we are working with Fondo Semilla, de Bolivia, Fondo Emerger, de Colombia, Fondo Casa de Brazil, Fondo Socioambiental de Peru, but also we are working with environmental funds in the Caribbean now, in San Vincent and Grenadines, no? So just talking about the Caribbean, yes, Caribbean sometimes has been relegated, no, from this discussion about climate, but we need to be aware that the blue economy is also very important. And specifically now, since some years ago, Guyana has been in the radar because Guyana is in the list of the 20 countries with more oil in the world. No? So the Guyana production of oil is also affecting the whole ecosystem in the Caribbean. But we have a lot of opportunities, of course, to create a lot of support, especially in the Caribbean, because the Caribbeans are working as a coalition, no, maybe 2 or 3 islands together. And this is how they really are growing now in terms of the ecosystem of international cooperation.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a good opportunity for me to also remind everyone that, Myriad USA does a lot with disaster programs generally and climate work globally. Part of what Monica is mentioning in terms of growing our presence and network in the Caribbean around this is that we have this sort of global pre-positioned network of climate responders and disaster and crisis responders that we've set up to help identify strong partners who are in their regions, in their communities, doing hyperlocal work, and making sure that when cyclical disasters or trends that we know are going to be increasing in frequency and intensity start to come seasonally more frequently, that we have good partners to send funds to and recommend to donors. So generally, this is a network we've been building globally, and we've been investing more and more time ensuring we have good partners. But Monica, thank you for that cap with the climate trend, which I think certainly is a highlight for Latin America, but is something that we're facing across all of our regions. And with that, I think that's the end of our sort of regional share outs. We do have one missing region, Asia and the Pacific, and that's because our director for that region sits in a time zone where it's difficult to bring her into this call. But having sort of one hat on that and a few minutes before we get into Q&A, I do want to just mention really quickly a couple of the trends that we've seen growing kind of politically in South Asia in particular. We know that India and Bangladesh in particular have been sort of in the spotlight as politics has been growing more polarized. We know from a philanthropic investment standpoint, India continues to be a country with a lot of interest and equally as much difficulty in terms of the onerous requirements to send foreign contributions into the country to support charities. And for Myriad USA, this is still our largest Asia market. So we continue to sort of navigate those legal requirements, political alignment, reputational risk, and make sure that we can support philanthropists with their giving to India. And I think the other place is really that one of the trends we've seen with a lot of corporate donors actually is a growing interest in funding mental health in Asia. I think that has started to become less stigmatized. A lot of corporations are getting feedback from employees and offices overseas that they want to see more equity in the programming that's being supported, whether it's people with disabilities, whether it's people with mental health. And generally, we're seeing a trend of interest and investment in Asia. And to sort of circle back on the climate point that Monica was raising, Asia is still the most disaster-prone region in the world. Over 70% of the disasters globally happen there. High vulnerabilities and risk, and it's an area that we continue to see a lot of disaster and crisis campaigns from our partners, our local partners, to support. And would be interested to hear if folks are starting to think about, coming to monsoon season in a few months, knowing that there's going to be flooding and typhoons again, and how donors are thinking about pre-positioning funds around preparedness, around early warning systems, things that can really prevent loss of life during some of these climate events. All right, well, I think we can turn to the Q&A. We have about 15 to 20 minutes to dig into that. So we've got a few that have been submitted, but please do add any that come to mind. And if you'd like one of our speakers to address it directly, definitely flag that. So one of the ones that's come through is a question about what third-party many community foundations are using for equivalency determinations, which is sort of going back to some of the IRS and US regulations to send funds overseas. I will say that Myriad USA works with community foundations to support international giving. Equivalency determination is certainly one way to do it, but we also support expenditure responsibility. And either of those are kind of determined based on the grant scope that's needed and what's required for local requirements as well. And so we have a third party that we work with, NGO Source, for EDs, for equivalency determinations, but we do in-house expenditure responsibility across probably 95% of our grants. So there's certainly other ways to get funds internationally besides equivalency determinations. So do reach out to us if you'd like to learn more about that. There are a few questions on the USAID freeze, so I'm going to try to group those, and then certainly if anyone on my team and on the speakers would like to add anything, please do. One is, generally, do we think that the exit of USAID is going to be creating an opportunity for philanthropy? Definitely. I think we're there right now. We've sort of been, I think, as two sectors running in parallel, and it's kind of time to intersect. And maybe this is forcing us to look more strategically at where there's need and where, critical life-saving support that's been funded by USAID is being frozen. And that's a starting point for us in terms of identifying good opportunities for philanthropists in the US to support our networks, where we're hearing more from them in terms of priorities that they have, funding that they need immediately before they might have to consider shutting down. But like I mentioned in the beginning, philanthropy is a flexible, nimble, risk-taking mechanism. And that's what we should be. Most of the bureaucracy we have in philanthropy is self-imposed. And so I encourage, donors out there who are ready to support this gap to be looking at organizations like ours to see how we can help support your strategy for that. Anything from the team that you wanted to add there?
I'm actually happy to jump on this. This is a
Yeah,
very
please.
good question. Thank you to the person who asked it. So I think it's important to make a difference between USAID funding, which is international aid, super restricted, project-based, project specific, I should say. And I say this because it has undermined, it's been very, very helpful, but restricted funding undermines impact at scale, okay? Like you have a limited scope in terms of how far and how deep you can go, and it's time bound. Philanthropy, on the other hand, is catalytic because it's flexible, as Sheena mentioned. It has a relatively higher appetite for risk, which is great because it can de-risk social innovation. So USAID funding is lack of funding now is very unfortunate because critical services are being compromised because of that. That said, there is huge opportunity for philanthropy to step in to continue that catalytic mechanism that it's built for. But there's also an opportunity for diaspora to invest in social innovation in given countries, whether that's in Africa, Latin America, and certainly the Middle East. We now, from a diaspora perspective, have the opportunity to go beyond remittances, beyond humanitarian relief funding, very important, but now to leverage our capital and invest in our communities and our people. So I think there's tremendous opportunity for diaspora to engage, and certainly for individual donors and institutional donors to support. Yeah.
Thank you, Kady. On the USAID piece, I'm just reading through these. What is sort of the role that we might see corporations play in funding ethical corporate giving? I think there's a lot of questions there on how the private sector generally is going to be impacted by things like tariffs, how their bottom line is going to impact what they end up spending on philanthropy, and corporations who are being pinged on DEI initiatives, who's going to step up, who's going to continue to drive funding for these areas, and who's not going to. So I would say it's a really uncertain time for what we might see coming down the pipeline for corporations and corporate giving. Again, being a private vehicle for giving, I hope that there's sort of a responsibility and an onus there to step up. But I think that is something that we're waiting to see. There are a couple questions on the nonprofits in our networks who are attending right now, and generally, community-based organizations who are interested in how Myriad can also be leveraged to access donors and support their organizations. And I'd love to ping my colleague, Ellena, who's I would say, our in-house expert on all things nonprofit service related, to maybe speak a bit about how we support them.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Sheena. I'm delighted to see that there are so many nonprofits on this call. For those that might not know us, and maybe you're on this call because you're familiar with us a little bit, we do work directly with nonprofits abroad through a tool that we call the American Friends Fund. And that tool allows an organization to be able to tap into funding in the US without having to create your own charity structure in the US. So that's much more cost efficient. It's much more time efficient. We have over 1,400 of these partnerships. Now, of course, part of that will mean that we have to do a due diligence process into your organization, understand what work you do, make sure that it aligns and that it's charitable. So there is some process there that should be explained more. It is on our website. If you go to myriadusa.org and you go to services, you'll see their services for nonprofits, and you'll find American Friends Fund. Somebody will put the link in the chat so you can see that. But I do encourage you to look there, and don't hesitate to reach out to one of the regional leads if you're interested in having that conversation. We would be more than delighted to connect with you one-on-one and chat about that.
Thank you. And I think my colleague Marina has also put a link in for some information on our website. Please do check that out. And as Ellena said, feel free to reach out to any of us if you all have additional questions. Ellena, you're already getting requests for your contact information. So you expect some emails.
Sure. I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, wonderful. Going through these. Are any program areas in decline in terms of funding? And maybe that's a question to the regional teams. We talked a little bit about where there's a greater need. Have you seen any shift in some areas that used to be funded that are drying up, or people are pivoting out from them?
Happy to jump on this one too.
Please.
Unfortunately, civil society has been shrinking for the past decade. And there are many factors leading to this. A couple of them are just some donors have closed shop. Some donors that were funding human rights institutions have moved on. Others that are still interested in it are being targeted for political reasons or are trying to be very safe in that process. That's definitely a space where I've been seeing decrease resources across Africa and also the Middle East. So yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, and something that I would like to add that maybe is positive, no, is for many years the tendency to support programs related to climate was very focused on conservationisms, but now there is more interest to support the communities that they live in their areas that should be protected, no? And I think this is a very important transition. And also I saw a lot of interest in the new generation, no, about climate issues, especially about the Amazon, because we have the culture or this new culture or new generation that maybe is more vegetarian or more vegan, or even is more interested in really how we can protect or save the world or the climate. So I think we have at least a very positive new tendency related to the young generations. And I know that there is a question about that in the chat, so I am just jumping.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it kind of leads to this other question that we have. There are two, which maybe we'll take together. Is one is this idea of investing versus donating, which I think a lot of us are sort of alluding to in the way we're talking about building partnerships, because these are long-term engagements with organizations who have been in their communities for many years, who have long-term plans to continue to support and build the communities that they serve. And so certainly, I think as an organization, those are our ideal partners, are ones that have built trust in their community, which builds trust in our relationships with them. So I think that's part of why some of that language around invest versus donate is something that is part of our culture here. And then another piece there is generational differences in how donors give, which is an interesting one, because I think we're now seeing a shift with a new gen of children of ultra high net worth individuals coming into money, thinking about how they want to do philanthropy, how they want to continue the legacy that maybe their parents or grandparents have done with regards to investing and donating and philanthropic strategic giving. I wonder, does anybody on our panel have experience maybe more with new generation or younger donors, where you've been seeing a difference in the way they are interested in engaging in philanthropy, or any insights there?
Yes, I saw young donors very interested in technology, in the use, for example, of technology to patrol the Amazon, or even now, of course, in AI, more in terms of how we are going to give power to people to take decisions about the information that they are going to be sharing in these new communicational tendencies. I think that but one of the challenges is how these young donors really are familiar with the philanthropic world, and I think this is why Myriad is in between both worlds. No, there is a young donor with resources, but is not necessarily versed or well versed in international philanthropy. You know, and many young donors, they like very concrete examples of programs. No, that can be very easy to understand and to process and to digest. No.
Absolutely. Less checks, more crypto.
Yeah.
No, that's helpful. Yeah, I think technology is going to change a lot of the way that people also get information and data, and so local organizations with stronger websites may attract more attention for new generation donors. There's just some real shifts that also I think charities need to be reflecting in terms of what builds confidence and what builds trust, that are going to become more and more important. All right, we got a couple more minutes. How do donors measure efficacy and impact of international nonprofit organizations? And a bit about our due diligence. I can mention a bit, and then would love to have some additional comments from the group. But I think a lot of the way that we approach conversations with local nonprofits are to really understand who they are and what they're trying to do and front load trust building, essentially. So instead of looking at due diligence as something that's a one-off activity that's administrative, it's really about building relationships that are built on more than just, certainly sound documentation, but also what is the reputation of that organization in their community? What kinds of relationships and partners do they already have? What's been their long-term legacy of impact, beyond maybe what a one-off donation is planning to fund. So our review generally is more than just that point in time. It's really looking holistically at some of those relationships and what it means for Myriad USA to engage in that partnership, because we're very proud of every one of our grants and grantees. And that's more than just a transactional relationship. So, that's a little bit more about the ethos behind our due diligence, I'll say, but certainly all the boxes are checked thoroughly. And then in addition, there's a bit of that, front loading of trust building. But anything else that the team wants to add to that?
I mean, maybe just the technical side of that answer. I really love the way you described that, Sheena, and I think that's really important for people to understand that we are building networks, we are serving the communities that we're granting to. But just to say that from a technical perspective, and you mentioned this already, Sheena, we are engaging in mostly expenditure responsibility, which we find to be quite flexible for the different kinds of partners that we have. So that is the due diligence standard that we are using. And then depending on certain situations, on projects, we might engage in an equivalency determination. But all that expenditure responsibility means is that we're examining the project itself and making sure that it's charitable, it's for the public benefit. So that really is a quite flexible tool that we are happy to use.
Fantastic. And we have lots of background that we can share with you over email if you're interested in sort of what our detailed questions are and what that process looks like more tangibly. I'm going to answer one more and then I think we're going to wrap up. So I like this one. We've got a clear message about transforming the diaspora beyond remittances. Are there any efforts that we know of for connecting and mobilizing the Latin America diaspora, similar to what we've been doing with the Africa Diaspora Network, which Kady's been very closely involved in? So Monica, for you, are you seeing anything around mobilizing Latin America diaspora that has an opportunity for folks to learn from?
Yes, we are planning this year to promote or to explore more giving circles. But last year we collaborated with an amazing network of donors, NEET, and there was a collaboration with NEET. There are donors very interested in international giving. And as Myriad, we invited different partners in Latin America, but also from Africa. And that was really a good opportunity to kind of understand what donors are looking in Latin America, in my case, in Latin America and the Caribbean. We realized that they are very interested in grassroots organizations, but organizations that are also exploring economic solutions, as still social startups, no? That they are like working with rural people, but trying to promote the quality, the increasement of the quality of life of impoverished communities. So for this year, we are planning more. So my email is in the chat, so feel free to reach me and I will share more of our plans for this year.
Perfect. Thank you. And I know we're a minute to close, so I want to end us on time and wrap us up with just a closing comment. A big word of thanks to everyone who joined, to our panelists. Like I said, this is the first of what we hope to be a series where we're bringing more knowledge and expertise from our team to the sector to help inform how philanthropy is done in the US. So I hope you all will be looking forward to more communications on that. If you do have any remaining questions, generally for our team, you can contact our general info at myriadusa.org. But I think also we dropped a bunch of specific folks' emails that you can get a more direct response for if you need. And I believe we have a survey that's going to be sent afterwards or now. So please do take a look at that and make sure that you follow up so we can make sure we understand how you've enjoyed the webinar and any suggestions. And yeah, thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.